Hello, in this presentation I'm going to be discussing institutional repositories. An institutional repository is a place where a university collects, stores, preserves, and disseminates digital content that is specific to the institution, its faculty, and its students. This digital content is unique to the institution because it is created by the institution's community. This archive of digital files is mainly comprised of the scholarly output of the institution. This can take the form of both published and unpublished materials. Examples are journal articles, conference papers, working papers, dissertations, theses, reports, book sections, and datasets. Institutional repositories can also contain materials that are records of the activities of the institution itself, such as documentation of events. Teaching materials such as syllabi are also sometimes included. To give a very brief history, institutional repositories became a thing in the early 2000s. The attractiveness of the concept of a university digitally preserving and disseminating its scholarly output merged together with rapid technical advances that were happening at the time. Repository software was being developed and the cost of hardware such as storage options was becoming less and less. This created a ripe opportunity for the emergence of institutional repositories. Part of the reason the concept of institutional repositories initially came into discussion is the inherent value and benefits associated with them. A lot of these benefits are connected to the concept of open access. Open access is the practice of making materials easily available at no cost to anyone with an internet connection. In the context of institutional repositories, open access means that the repository is available on a website on the internet and that people outside of the university are also able to access all of the content. The benefits of an open access institutional repository are largely connected to scholarly communications receiving increased exposure and use. When a scholar, for example, deposits a material into an open access repository, it maximizes visibility by connecting the material to web search engines that may index the content on the broader World Wide Web. This is of value to the scholar who potentially receives more attention, as well as the general public that are able to access the scholarly materials. The university itself also benefits from demonstrating the impressiveness of the collective intellectual output of its students and faculty. Another consideration is the security that an institutional repository adds by acting as a long-lasting, stable preservation tool if properly funded and properly managed. The costs and potential challenges when it comes to these repositories indeed have to do in part with funding and management of the tool. The initial setup and ongoing maintenance of an institutional repository involves significant financial costs, and the management, both from a technology and from an administrative and policy perspective, can also create challenges. On the technology side of things, a university must consider whether to establish its own proprietary software or to take advantage of one of the commercial options. The two most prominent softwares for institutional repositories appears to be DSpace and Digital Commons. In a study of undergraduate institutional repositories, one scholar found that 57% of the institutions used Digital Commons and 31% used DSpace. In contrast, on the policy and management side of potential challenges, there are a variety of factors to consider. As an example, one of them is submission agreements. Institutional repositories tend to require its community members who submit works to enter into a formal agreement that consists of checking a box, for instance, before depositing the material. The reason this is necessary has to do in part with potential legal risks to the host of the material. If a scholar's work contains mistakes or infringements, then that could pose risks to the repository. So the agreement often requires the submitter to take responsibility for any of those occurrences. The agreement also includes provisions that allow the university enough ownership over the material to disseminate it. Another interesting fact from a policy perspective is that many universities actually require the submission of theses, dissertations, and other major scholarly works to the repository as a kind of mandate. So I think that gives a decent overview of the background of institutional repositories, the benefits, challenges, important themes, etc. Right now I'd like to briefly show you an example of a prominent institutional repository, as well as a database that indexes institutional repositories and tracks statistics about them. So on this webpage, you see Oxford University Research Archive, which is the institutional repository of Oxford University. And just to do a quick search to showcase the way a typical institutional repository might look, you can see there are a variety of filters available. And under item type, you can see the kinds of materials that tend to be in institutional repositories. They tend to be materials that are scholarly in nature, both published and unpublished. You can see there's a deposit section where members of the Oxford University community can go and actually deposit their work. Another website that I wanted to show you is the Registry of Open Access Repositories, which is a database that indexes as many repositories, institutional repositories, as possible across the World Wide Web. So you can see right now there's a total of 4,693 repositories that have been indexed here. So it's a good website to go to if you want to find some real-world examples of repositories. And also, more interestingly, if you want to track and look at statistics about repositories. So you can see for some repositories, it actually gives a chart illustrating deposit activities, the number of records related to each of these repositories. And also, there's a graphical analysis section of the registry here that allows for the charting of statistics on graphs. And so I was really interested in known repositories over time. So how many repositories were out there, back in the past sometime, and how many are present today, and how has that changed over time? Well, this graph gives an illustration of that, and you can see there's some pretty exponential growth that's gone on, and you can see how back in the early 2000s, right when it was being discussed as a new concept, and right when the technology was becoming cheaper, you can see how in the early 2000s the number of repositories was beginning to increase, and then since then it's just skyrocketed. So I think it's really fascinating. I hope that you learned something valuable, and thank you for watching my presentation.